Brother Justin, thank you very much for those kind remarks. Thank you, all the organizers and hosts of this event, and very special thanks to the fellows that you're willing to allow me to join you in the discussions on these 2 days. The relationship between the stewardship of knowledge and evangelization, a theological perspective, and if I might add, using a term from Thomas's commentary on Job and the way he views Job, a theological perspective, ex fiducia veritatis, in trust that there is truth. Wisdom, or a sapiential approach to science, has long had a bad reputation. To choose just one example among many derisions of sapiential claims, one can recall the programmatic essay published in the very first issue of Logos by Edmund Husserl in 1911, criticizing Wilhelm Dilthey's worldview philosophy for its reception and expansion of hermeneutics as a poor sapiential alternative to phenomenology's promise to develop philosophy as a profoundly first and strict or rigorous science. The young Heidegger would echo his teacher's mockery of the sapiential model of philosophy, but the synthesis of hermeneutics and phenomenology in Being and Time seemed to the teacher to be a victory for the sapiential reading of facticity, and therefore to deepen the crisis of the European or Enlightenment spirit. If a line can be drawn from the hermeneutic programmatic of Being and Time to the history of being thematic of the later Heidegger, and now to the 9 printed volumes of the Black Notebooks with their own massive Seinsgeschichtliche critique of Jewish Christian traditions, one might be tempted to seek to return to Husserl's critique of the sapiential alternative to the ideal or dream of rigorously exact, sober, and liberating science. The critique of claims to religious wisdom is today best known from viewpoints external to religions, particularly those oblivious to the mutual causal links between forms of secularism and forms of violent, religiously colored reaction against the dialectics of Western secularism. But even within the theological discourse, there has never been a lack of critique of sapiential ideals. This critique rarely takes the form of a categorical rejection of all forms of wisdom. More often it involves a debate about what a sapiential sense of theology should and should not mean. In the 13th century, the famous alternative between Bonaventure and Thomas Aquinas on the sapiential character and dynamic of theology named 2 of the most prominent forms of sapiential imagination. Before turning to these discussions near the beginnings of the mendicant movement and near the beginnings of the Dominican order, I would like to mention 3 prominent current theological controversies in which questions of interdisciplinarity surface that call for a sapiential approach to the stewardship of the sciences and a comprehensive sense of evangelization. The 3 controversies to be mentioned here are: 1, interdisciplinarity and the place of theology at the university; 2, the conciliar and post-conciliar appeal to the science of the times; and 3, integrative and heterotopological or alienational models of the loci theologici, of theological places and commonplaces. The 3 issues touch on one another, and each of them shows how there can be a certain deficiency and a certain excess in interdisciplinary relationships, which to avoid is arguably a contemporary task of wisdom. So first, interdisciplinarity in the place of theology at the university. The rise of specialization in the individual disciplines and of the rise of specialization in the individual disciplines and the rise of the research university among institutions of higher education has brought many advances in individual disciplines and technology, but increasingly at the cost of the idea of the university most famously promoted by John Henry Newman. Newman stressed the place both of teaching, not merely of research, and of cross-disciplinary discourse as essential elements of the university. With these constituent factors comes the role of teaching and of developing theology in dialogue with other university disciplines. Alistair McIntyre, Reinhard Hutter, and COA President John Garvey have all been among those seeking to retrieve Newman's observations for the reform of today's universities. Whether theology is directly a part of the university, as is possible at private universities, or associated in a manner such as here at GTU with UCB, that is not such an important question as the attention of theology to other disciplines and the attention of those disciplines to the work of many of the theological subdisciplines. Both forms of attention, both directions, are directed against a lack of interdisciplinarity. In Germany, where theological faculties are most often located at state-run universities, but not only there, the contrary challenge has also arisen. The State Commission for the Management of German University Studies, the so-called Wissenschaftsrat, or Federal Council on Science and Humanities, has begun recommending a double strategy: A, to encourage the transformation of confession-based theology into cultural and religious studies, and B, in a shift from the debates of the 1970s that questioned the presence of theology at the state universities, to encourage that the training of all future ministers, Christian or Muslim, occur preferably at just such state-sponsored centers of religious studies so as to minimize confessional identity and diversity in the future. In this view, shared even by numerous ecclesiastics, religious studies at the university level should be structured to promote forms of ecclesial identity more thoroughly accommodated to the wider society than was often the case in the past or the present. I could give you a quote on that later, directly from this council. But in any case, with that position, the dialogue of theology with the sciences would be replaced by a monologue of merely cultural disciplines. The polemic behind much of the irony of identifying allegedly post-factical thinking is at ease with this environment. Second, then, the conciliar and post-conciliar appeals to the signs of the times. The final document approved by the Second Vatican Council, the Pastoral Constitution on the Church in the World of this Time, bundled many of the major vectors of the Council towards today's discussion of the relationship between pastoral care and doctrinal truth. Early drafts of Gaudium et Spes had intended in this context to use repeatedly and as a structural tool a qualitatively new attention to the signs of the times, designed to allow doctrinal traditions to cast light upon and be understood in light of contemporary cultural, political, and economic developments. What is sometimes overlooked in the reception of the history of the Council, however, is the learning curve at and after the Council, supported here by ecumenical and non-European voices. The Council had begun by adopting a restriction of the signs of the times merely to signs of God's obvious favor. The usage is clear throughout, notably in Dignitatis Humanae, number 15, also the Declaration on Religious Liberty. There, two trends of the times are first identified: the trend towards greater religiosity and, opposed to that, the trend towards a greater persecution of religion. Then the text reads as follows, quote, "This council greets with joy the first of these two facts as among the signs of the times. With sorrow, however, it denounces the other fact as only to be deplored." One can see the sense of signs of the time as being reserved to signs of God's favor. As an official observer at the World Council of Churches, the Reformed theologian Lukas Fischer intervened to warn against using in the final drafts of Gaudium et Spes this unbiblical and purely theological sense of the phrase and its import, which would too quickly identify the signs of the times with God's own voice. Just to give you one example from a memorandum that was some 5.5 pages long, if we look at the times, then we hear in them not just the voice of God, but rather also the voice of darker and more destructive powers. We ourselves stand not simply on the side of God, rather our eye is often blinded and taken captive. We could therefore not simply say without further ado that we perceive the voice of God in time. The Holy Spirit must come and make clear to us in the ocean of ambivalences, and we must therefore pray in the Church for the grace that the Holy Spirit will give us prophets who can, in fact, understand the phenomena of time not just in a superficial way, but in its entire reality, end quote. Fisher's sustained critique on this superficial use of signs of the time changed the Council. It was a moment of ecumenical learning. He helped the Council to agree on a restriction of the phrase to just one carefully considered and nuanced use in Gaudium et Spes, 4, to examine the signs of the times and to interpret them in light of the gospel. This enhanced sense prepared the way for the Latin American Bishops' Conference in Colombia, in Medellin, in 1968, to expand the signs of the times to include explicitly signs of structural sin that called for critique as opposed to being signs of God's absolute and unconditioned will. Prosperity is not always a sign of God's will and favor. As necessary as the identification of the disclosive value of doctrinal truth for and in the signs of the times is, current attempts appealing to the Council in order to hear God's voice in the signs of the times must be seen as ahistorical and regressive. Here too, it is a sapiential task to avoid both the deficiency and an excess of cultural accommodation. The goal, to use one of Newman's notes of genuine development, is to assimilate the good which we do not have without being fully assimilated by the other. The third issue, integrative and alienational or heterotopological models of the Loci Theologici. Aware of ancient Cicero and Aristotle's works on the topics, humanistic Rudolf Agricola, some 50 years before the Reformation, and Protestant, Melanchthon above all, precedents, the 16th century innovative, if enormously polemical, Thomistic disciple of Francisco de Vitoria, Melchior Cano, developed first in his Summa commentary and then in his major work the notion of the Loci Theologici, of theological places, or if you like, better, theological sources, authoritative sources, understood here as the authoritative sources of theology. In his most famous work, De Locis Theologicis, Cano distinguished two different groups of such loci, 7 Loci Theologiae proprii, also 7 authoritative places of theology in the proper sense, and 3 Loci Theologiae alieni, of those which are important for theology, vital for theology, but themselves somehow not of a theological origin. And he includes here natural reason, including the various sciences, the history of philosophy and law, and testimony of historians about human history, the Humanae Auctoritas Historiae. Beginning in 1978, first in the context of the tension between theology and magisterium, more recently in the context of the spatial turn in the cultural sciences and the debates about cultural accommodationalism, there has been a dispute in the Roman Catholic world about whether Cano's work can best be developed in an integrative or in an alienational or heterotopological manner. The former model, the integrative model, initiated by Max Zeckler and continued most extensively by his student Bernhard Körner, sees here the basis for an epistemological Catholicity. Epistemological Catholicity. You won't be Catholic unless you have all of these sources working for you. So not just magisterium, but also tradition and many other things, and not just theology, but also this wider sense of this. You need also an epistemological Catholicity, which demands the cooperation of all the Lotzi, old and new, theological and episcopal, proper to the faith and more general. The alternative, the alienational model, initiated as a theology of dissent by Elmar Klinger and developed with borrowings from Michel Foucault by Klinger's student Hans Joachim Sander as a theology of the other, as a heterotopology, asserts the primacy of the Lotzi alieni among these, the locus of history, and this largely in the sense of contemporary history. It is hard to see, however, how this loss of the subject can maintain its sense of the otherness of the other, so that again the twin challenge of deficiency and excess in theology's relation to the other recurs. The early history of Dominican study ideals reveals a gradual and hesitant, but in the end decisive opening towards philosophy and the sciences. And I want to address that just briefly, because I see here an echo of what's going on in these three controversies today. Albert the Great's often cited phrase, I cite it too all the time, little cards and so on, quaerere veritatem in dulcedine societatis, to seek the truth in the joy of community, is set in the context, typically Albert, set in the context of his complaint that many in the Dominican order seek to prevent its brethren precisely from this joy and this quest. The plan of study from 1259 articulates an ideal not yet realized. If you look at the history of the order, you will see that study was a huge issue from the very beginning. It is 1/3 of the entire first constitutions from 1220. You have government, and then study, and then preaching. And that shows you more or less the innovation they had envisioned for study in the order. And they name the motivation. The motivation is mercy, in order to carry the suffering of the other as if it were one's own, and focused most particularly on that suffering which is the inability to believe aright. In order to carry the inability to believe aright as one's own, one has to study the times, study also times before and hopes for times after, and that is therefore the reason why study is one of these three pillars of the Dominican order. And yet, as solid as that commitment to study was, the commitment to the universities was a little more hesitant than it might seem. Dominic sends out his brethren to the university cities, but not always to universities where there is a theology faculty, and so they make their own theology on the side, and slowly, but only slowly and against certain opposition, do they open themselves to the wider range of disciplines at the university, and therefore to the philosophy as documented in that document of 1259, which you may have received as part of the preparations for today. The plan of study from 1259 articulates an ideal, therefore not yet realized, but it also attests the presence of an ideal of wisdom that found one of its classic expressions in the idea of wisdom articulated by Thomas Aquinas, one of the authors of that document, with a good deal of autonomy given to insight, science, and prudence. As Richard Scheffler has described this model of wisdom, you can separate out models of wisdom according to how much room they allow for other functions such as insight, reasoned argument, and practical counsel. And if they allow much room, then you have the kind of wisdom that became, in fact, the model not only for Thomas Aquinas, but for the majority of the Dominican order. This model has a relatively strong, but certainly not blind acknowledgement of the pre-theological efforts of philosophy, the sciences, statecraft, and custom. The continuation of this particular sapiential tradition is consonant with the development in the recent magisterium that has come to see evangelization as encompassing the discrete projects of proclamation and dialogue. Proclamation is not dialogue, but both of these distinct and discrete realities are needed for there to be all-encompassing evangelization. Therefore, a parallel again to having genuine theology, but in dialogue with the genuine sciences which are not theological. The theological and philosophical faculties here at DSPT are fortunate, in my eyes, to have fellows from diverse disciplines and walks of life to assist them in both aspects of evangelization, proclamation, and dialogue. And I hope that the fellows also will be enriched in their combination of proclamation and dialogue to draw on the resources provided by these faculties with their teachers and students, with their questions, their conversations, and hopefully with the right choice of quarrels. Thank you very much.